Good afternoon. My name is Curtis Valentine, co-director of the Reinventing America Schools project, and I am your moderator for today. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Reinventing America Schools project, the 74, and Education Civil Rights Now. The Reinventing America Schools project is housed at the Progressive Policy Institute and promotes a model of schools we call 21st century school systems, or school systems that provide parents more choice and give schools more autonomy in return for more accountability. Our research shows that in urban America, public school systems that do this produce the most rapid improvement in student performance. The purpose of today's webinar is a second part to a discussion we had on the growing movement for constitutional right to a quality public education in America at the state level. Understanding individual states have control over how they provide public education to its citizens, we will learn from experts from California and Minnesota about the grassroots efforts and fight for the right to a quality public education. So let's get started. Before I ask my panelists to introduce themselves, we're going to survey you, the audience. At this time, you're going to be able to choose which subgroup you identify with the most, whether it be a parent, an educator, a funder, a journalist, an advocate, or a policymaker. If you're like me, you identify with more than one. But for the purpose of this discussion, which group do you most identify with? And this will help our panelists structure some of their answers to ensure that we are meeting the audience's needs. And so while you all do that, I'm going to throw it to our audience and allow them to introduce themselves. And so I'm going to ask them to introduce their name, say their name, their organization, and what their organization does. With that being said, we're going to start on the West Coast with Christina Laster. Please introduce yourself, who you're with, and what you do.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be here. My name is Christina Laster. As Curtis said, I'm out here in the West Coast, California, and I am the Director of Policy and Legislation with the National Parents Union. We are an organization of parents, activists, advocates, all looking to change the way that education has been traditionally handed to our children. And so that's what we show up for every day. I'm glad to be here again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us, Christina. We're going to keep it in the Golden State, but we're going to take it down to the Bay, and we have Lakisha Young with us today.
I think it's up to the Bay, Curtis.
Up to the Bay.
Thank you. I'm Lakisha Young. I'm CEO of the Oakland Reach. I'm excited to be here today and with all the panelists. And, you know, the Oakland Reach is about, you know, really at this stage of the game, we're about listening to our families and building the solutions. We're about the how. You know, no more talking about what needs to happen. Our systems have long not done what needs to happen. I think it's time for us, and especially us as parents, to be continuing to build those solutions and using advocacy to really push the system to make those solutions happen. We believe with that, we will get to full liberation for families. And in California, I mean, Oakland, California, and across the country. So I'm just, you know, happy to be here and doing another webinar with Curtis after so long.
Thank you so much for joining us again today, Keisha. We're going to take it to the upper Midwest with Nevada Littlewolf.
Thank you much. My name is Nevada Littlewolf, and I'm the executive director for Our Children Minnesota. And we are the organization that is doing the work to pass the Page Amendment in Minnesota, which is our constitutional amendment to guarantee a civil right for all children in Minnesota to have access to a quality public education. We are an organization comprised of parents, teachers, students, education advocates. We are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Hmong, Somali, and more. We are urban, suburban, rural, and tribal nations, and we are business leaders and nonprofit leaders. We're a very strong coalition here in Minnesota working to have our constitutional amendment get through the legislature this year and on the ballot in November and ultimately passed and enacted. So thank you for having me here today with you all.
Thank you for joining us, Nevada. We're going to be joined also pretty soon by State Representative Hoden Hassan as well. But before we go on, I definitely want to recognize my brother Chris Stewart, also from Minnesota, but is currently in the city of brotherly love. Please introduce yourself, Christopher Stewart.
Well, I'm Chris Stewart. I'm the CEO of Brightbeam. We are a national education nonprofit. We focus mostly on using digital activism to inform the public and help people take action on behalf of children. We run an annual child justice campaign that contains all the issues, the practices, and the practices and policies that we think should be prioritized to help young people thrive in their youth. And I am in the city of brotherly love right now, but I am also with Nevada here in Minnesota.
No, thank you all for joining us. We have an all-star panel of experts on a most important topic. Before we get into our first question, I do want to show our survey results to see who's actually in the audience. And as you can see, nearly 60% of those who are tuning in see themselves as advocates. The overwhelming majority. And so these are folks who may also be parents, educators, and policymakers. But on today, this is something that is incredibly important. And you're going to hear from 4 amazing individuals who are going to give you a lot of information to take your advocacy to your capital. And so before we jump into today's topic, I want to put it to context. Today is the second day of Black History Month, a month dedicated to the recognition and excellence of African Americans and their contribution to this country. Chris, I want to come to you first. What role particularly have African Americans historically played in establishing the foundation for public education in America?
I think this is such an important question because when we talk about Black history and Black folks' place within American history, we often talk as if we were bystanders or somehow the recipients of other people's efforts. And it's just not true. We are foundational to public education in the United States and education in general. Prior to public education, we were by hook or crook getting our own people educated in church basements, in backwoods, in meeting houses, to whatever extent we could. Literacy was freedom to us. Education was freedom to us. So we were putting our own nickels and quarters and dimes. We were building schools. We were hiring teachers. We were firing teachers. We were housing teachers in our houses so that they could teach in our communities by our own kind of system of Black education. We were doing it kind of on our own. When it comes to the Reconstruction era, African Americans played a primary role in actually founding what we know today as tax-funded public education, universal for all. That was very much out of the Black Reconstruction era, Black Republicans who knew that our interest was tied up with everybody else's interest. Ignorant people anywhere was a threat to us. So they pushed for public education tax-funded for white students before white folks did in the South. And we forget that part. So people should thank us. People should say thank you, because at that time, it was very much an aristocracy, right? Like, education was for the elite, the plantation owners and others, not for poor white folks, not for Black folks, not for anybody else. So we played a foundational role in taking taxes into the coffers and creating schools for all.
And so here we are, in spite of everything you just said, in 2022, and we're still having a discussion about whether a quality public education in America is a right or a privilege. And so are you surprised that we're still having this conversation, that we're still have yet to establish that a quality public education is a right in this country?
No, I'm not surprised. I'll say why. So first of all, this is why the work that Lakisha, Christina, Nevada, they all do is so important, is because there never was a right to a quality education. There was barely a right to an education. And in most states, there was a right to an adequate or uniform education, not one that actually made you better, not one that actually helped you self-actualize and realize your dreams, or even one that was quality, or the outcomes were supposed to be good. Just adequate, uniform, standard education is what you've had. This idea that should be a quality, a right to quality, is newer. And I think that's why I'm not surprised at all. I'm invigorated by it though, because it's about time. It's the moment to say, we did 150 years of adequate and uniform, and all it did was sort kids of different income levels and different colors into different classrooms and put them on track for nothingness, put them on track for inequality. Now it's time to guarantee the big ticket. The big ticket is a quality education for all, and that's new, so I'm not surprised.
Keisha, I want to come to you. I mean, similarly, are you surprised we're still having this conversation in 2022 and having to fight for things that I think many of us maybe assume we already had, or until it was brought up to us that was not, written into our constitutions? What about this surprised you the most?
I'm not surprised. I'm pissed off about it, right? But I'm definitely not surprised. And I will add that, like, I think what's hurting us comes from the outside and the inside. And until both are sort of healed and we get really focused and make the main thing, it's going to be really hard for us. We'll be having the same conversation 5 years from now. So not surprised, but have a much stronger understanding, having been in the work in this way for a while, of like, what is at play that is in our way. And it's not all from the outside. I think we get in our own way as well. And would really like for us to be having a very different conversation, Curtis, about this, 5 years from now, but not surprised. Pretty pissed off though. Pretty is actually a PC word, really pissed off.
In Minnesota, and we discussed this in our part one, I believe the current term is Minnesota provides students an adequate education. I think the term adequate is used. That's probably the only term, only time I've actually heard that term. People say, I want to give you an adequate anything. My mind always goes to the least. And so, right now in Minnesota, every child has access to an adequate education. But this fight seems to draw a very clear line when it comes to the term quality. As an Nevada, I want to come to you. How does Our Children Minnesota define what quality looks like in your state?
Curtis, thanks. That's right. Like in Minnesota, it is legally defined that we have access to a uniform system of public education, and that system is defined legally as adequate. In Minnesota, we are proposing that we elevate education to the higher standard of quality. And we are really working across the state. I had mentioned, like, the Page Amendment team and our Page partners represent a vast and growing momentum in our state to create the civil right. And while we don't have yet a community defined and well-rounded definition of school quality, because I think that every community, every state should be taking those things into consideration, we do collect an abundance of data here in Minnesota. And our data reinforces the power of a great school. So, we know that 60% of all Minnesota students are not at reading and math level, right? 60%. So that's still overall. All 87 counties in Minnesota are impacted by our educational disparities, but overall, we're not doing well. Those numbers plummet to 20 to 30% for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and low-income students across the state. And we know that this has an impact on our economy. We lose out on about $1.1 billion in our GDP annually as a result of these disparities. And in Minneapolis, for example, students who attend a high quality school are twice as likely to graduate from high school and 6 times more likely to earn a post-secondary degree. And so those are like compelling statistics that should be motivators and should help us understand how we're moving towards a quality standard, right? There's an opportunity here drawing on factors around academics, the school climate, and equity, and to also support schools in their journey to quality so that every child in Minnesota benefits from a school that prepares them for success. And with the Page Amendment, we talk about an education that fully prepares children to participate in the economy, society, and our democracy, right? That is what a quality education framework looks like. And we continue to convene conversations across the state in rural areas, urban areas, tribal nations, to hear what are people seeing in terms of what is working in schools, and also to really shine a light on the problems we have. Because there's a lot of people who I think are kind of in denial about what the real problems with public education are, and the fact that we're leaving so many people behind. I mean, in Minnesota, Chris will understand this, I think, but in Minnesota, we love to brag about what we're doing really well. But it's not, but when you disaggregate data in Minnesota, you can see that we're actually, we're worst in nation around issues related to racial equity across the board, and education is a really big place where we're seeing that disparity. And so we think about, what is the solution? It's working on correcting our framework.
And you mentioned this term, the Page Amendment. And for those who watched our first webinar, we actually had former Justice Alan Page on the panel. But for those who did not listen in, can you briefly talk about what the Page Amendment is and what it will do? Absolutely.
So our current educational provision in our state constitution was written in 1857, and it provides our foundation for public education, which basically says that the legislature must, have a thorough and efficient and general and uniform system of public education. And that thorough and uniform, general and uniform system must be providing an adequate education for students. And so we know that in 1857, there were a lot of problems in our country, and we know that there were voices that were not at the table to help to inform what our public education system should look like. And so the Page Amendment, we're really refocusing to children, right? To create a civil right for children to have access to a quality public education. So in this, that we're not catering all of our resources into a system. Instead, we're really redirecting all of our resources towards the child and ensuring that that child comes out of public education with a quality, having had a quality education that sets them up for the future. And so, the Page Amendment is really, again, focusing on children. Right now, I'm actually, live from the Minnesota State Capitol, and this week is the start of our legislative session here in Minnesota. And we're working so hard to ensure that our lawmakers are engaging around this issue, that they're signing on to the Page Amendment, that they're being a part of the conversation to make this, to move this forward and to make sure that we have it on the ballot in November, because we know that 79% of Minnesotans across the state support the Page Amendment. And for our process here in Minnesota, we have to have the legislature put it on the ballot for people to vote on it. And ultimately for us, we want it on the ballot. We want each and every Minnesotan to be able to weigh in and to make their voice heard in terms of ensuring that our value, our highest value in Minnesota, which is ensuring that our children have access to that quality public education, is heard and then is enacted. And that will change the future of Minnesota, and it will change the prospects for generations of children to come. So we're really excited to be doing this work here in Minnesota and getting it onto the ballot.
No, thank you so much, and for all you're doing. I want to go to California, and I want to come to you, Christina. And in many ways, people sort of talk about Minnesota and California similarly, because the two states have sort of taken this effort the furthest. But in many ways, the approaches are a little different when it comes to how these amendments will be enacted. So Christina, tell us about the process the state of California will undergo to amend the state constitution to ensure every student has a right to a quality education.
Thank you. So first, I want to acknowledge what my dear sister Keisha said. She's pissed, right? We're in the same state. Nah, sis, we're indignant. Okay. And so if we look at the outcomes, and then I want to acknowledge that Christopher said it's Black History Month. Yes. If we look at the outcomes, they're criminal. Right. Our children are graduating not able to read and write and function at a rate where they should be able to read and write. And so that's what parents care about. So when we talk about the process and we try to merge organizing with access to law, parents might not understand the political processes, the governance structure, the constitutional amendments and guarantees and things like that. But parents want their children to be literate. So that is part of the process. Making sure that we as parents with the concept have the say in what ultimately is decided for our children. And so at the National Parents Union, we took a concept and really over a year vetted that information and came out with a constitutional amendment that we could take back to the state and look at that process. How can we get this amendment passed? Because the state's constitution reads standard, basic, free, uniform. None of our children fit that criteria. Our children are great, right? Nobody wants to send their child to a place where there's no minimum baseline standard for what the outcomes are going to produce, and parents are not looking for that type of education. And so it's way past time to be able to pursue constitutional amendments in every state because they're outdated and they don't speak to a minimum baseline standard. And they produce the outcomes of basic, right? And not even basic in some ways. And so we started to really look at that process, merging organizing with governance structures, with law, talking to lawyers, constitutional amendment framework. How can it have equal protections embedded? We know that our Black and brown children go to school and often experience discrimination. So really refining that language around equal protections and giving the parents the ability to pursue some type of accountability beyond what's already existing, because we know that it hasn't worked, to be able to say these outcomes that you produced are not okay. And my child should have higher outcomes academically when they are receiving the education. That's what education's intended purpose should do. Even the UN has a right to a fundamental right to a quality education, right? So that children can reach their fullest potential. And so part of the constitutional amendment process was having parents all together, vetting this language, saying what we need, polling to find out what parents really wanted, bringing it back to the community and saying, is this what you really want? And explaining exactly what does it mean to have a constitutional amendment, and now pursuing a ballot measure that will have an initiative. So that was a part of our process.
And so what role are parents playing, and can parents play in order, particularly in California, in order to bring this to fruition?
So particularly paying attention to the ballot measures, right? I mean, really aiming to put this on the ballot for 2024, but then reaching out to the community to offer that education around what is the constitutional guarantee or right about equality education, and really helping the community to understand that there is no guarantee, a constitutional guarantee. A lot of parents are upset. They get mad and say, you know, I have a right to, but really constitutionally we don't. Right? Because there is no minimum baseline standard. And so even though our desires and our purpose statements all sound good, we need to have them codified, which means they need to be in law for them to be actionable items. So really, really starting to have those discussions in your communities and supporting the work to pursue that constitutional amendment and change really actively.
Sorry, back to you, Nevada, really quickly. What can parents in Minnesota do in order to support Our Children Minnesota in your effort to ensure that this ballot measure is passed?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing parents do is really have conversations with people in their community around why this is so important to them. We just had a press conference here at the Capitol, and we had just so many parents show up for that to really tell why they care about this, tell their story and what it means, and what it means for their children. Because we're really hearing, you know, from so many parents that are like, this is impacting my kids right now, right? Like, and we don't want the future generations to have to deal with this, but we also want to like get our legislators to pay attention right now, because we're the ones who are really we're feeling the pain of the problem right now. And so I think the biggest thing that we see parents do is really get out, tell their story, talk to legislators, talk to others in their community, and really do what what is pretty like high value for us is relational organizing. So being able, especially during COVID right now, it's being able to talk to your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues, to others, to be able to say, hey, do you have a child in public school right now? Or maybe you have grandchildren in public school right now, or maybe you just care about the future of Minnesota and our economic outcomes and our social outcomes. Like, how do you start talking to people about the importance and the impact of a strong quality public education? And in those conversations, then urging everyone to call their legislators to get them to do the work on the Page Amendment and get it past the session. That's how our parents are engaging.
Thank you. We want to go back actually to the audience one more time and get an impression of what our parents, our advocates, educators are most comfortable doing as it relates to advocacy in this space. And so we're going to put out a poll, and you only can choose one. And the question is, what would you be most comfortable doing to ensure a constitutional amendment to equality education? Would you be comfortable testifying at a hearing, writing a letter to a legislator, attending a rally like Nevada organized today, donating money, or writing an op-ed? What of all of these 5 things would you be most comfortable doing in order to ensure that your state had a constitutional right to a quality education? While you're doing that, I do want to come to you, Keisha. Just understanding that throughout history, social movements relied on community-based organizations with a vested interest in the outcome of what they were fighting for. In many ways, like Oakland Reach is that SNCC, is that organization that is embedded within the community and is run by people from the community. And so, what organizing tactics has Oakland Reach used to bring about legislative and political change in the past in Oakland and in California?
I know you have another question with that too, Curtis, that I feel like I want to tack on to close out what they've said. Is that okay if I start with that first?
It's your world. Go ahead.
Because you asked a question about the amendment and how, So if I can ask that first, and then I'll answer the second part of it. But I do want to piggyback on this a bit, because obviously this amendment is in play in conversation here in California. I think our big push is, I'll start with this. I think I've learned over the past 5 years is that parents don't want to go to board meetings. I never wanted to go to any board meeting I ever went to. I've been to over 100. We don't want to write letters. We just want to drop our kids off at school and know that they're going to like read and do math and do so at a level where they have options. So if we think about that simplicity that's been so complicated for our communities for so long, it may force us to rethink the ways in which we push parent rights and parent power, right? So what I'll say is, when I think about this amendment, it's a law, right? It's something that is big and lofty. And so the question is how does it become accessible to a parent? How do we help legislators understand what quality actually even means? I've got to let some judge has got to vote on this, and what is his definition of it? So to make this connect to families, I truly believe that you have to have the work that shows the system what power and quality looks like. So I'm not trying to do a shameless plug for the hub, but that is one of the reasons why we built the hub, is to show the system how the hell our families want it to be educated and treated, right? And now that we have it, now that our kids are reading, our kids experience learning gains when everybody else was talking about learning loss. We now have a model. We now have something to say, this is what quality looks like. That's number one. Number two, we're about to step into going after the collective bargaining agreement, because parents should be at the table on decisions that are being made on how, when, and where their kids are being educated. I can't trust a judge in Sacramento to understand that parents being at the table for a collective bargaining agreement is how we get to quality. We have to actually say, here are the 4 or 5 things that is happening on the ground that spells quality to us. And if we ever have to bring this to you in a lawsuit, you know exactly how to vote on this stuff. So I feel like to make this connected to the families, the work that's happening on the ground, the solutions that are happening on the ground have to be the examples of quality. We are responsible for building the examples of quality that we want the state to uphold. If we don't, we are going to get it wrong, even in our efforts to make them agree that we deserve quality. I hope that makes sense, what I just said. If it didn't, I can clarify. But I think it does lead into the tactics and organizing piece. Obviously, we've had a policy called the opportunity ticket. We won that policy in 2019. Ironically, 3 years later, we are thrusted back into that policy again because our district is about to go through some consolidations and closures. And for folks who don't know the opportunity ticket, it essentially says that if there's consolidations or closures, folks from those schools have a priority. Families have a priority of where they want to go. And if they choose to go to a school in the hills, they will have preference above neighborhood schools, neighborhood families. We won that policy in 2019, but there was so much political ruckus around this consolidation stuff that it got put on hold. We had the pandemic. So now it's back and the opportunity ticket is back thrusted in front of us. And we weren't prepared for it, to be honest with you. And as we speak, we are trying to get ourselves prepared for the implementation of a policy that we put forward that got held for 3 years, right? To make sure that this policy, see, everybody is like screaming and fussing and hollering in Oakland right now. On February 8th, the district is going to make a decision, whatever decision they make. And on February 9th, everybody that's hustling and hollering and all this stuff, they're going to go back to their houses and straighten up their Black Lives Matter signs in their windows, right? Who's going to back these families up? Who's going to make sure that they understand what this means for the future of their children, right? So that's where organizations like ours on the ground, like who are solely focused on families and kids, that's it. We have to build the solutions, right? And when we talk about, I mentioned just a minute ago about the collective bargaining agreement, right? Why are we not challenging the collective bargaining agreement? This has to do with our babies, the ways in which they're taught, the time of day of when they're taught, everything that we were trying to do when it came to the hub and bringing innovation to our families and power to our families, we couldn't do because of state legislation and agreements that were made that our families were not at the table at. When are we going to say enough, not just in our mouth, but in our action and our advocacy, right? And how are we going to help the state understand that these are the type of tables we want to be at? These little mini plastic tables that you guys are setting up for parents, these are not the tables we want. We want the hard redwood tables with the gavels. How are these people going to make the right decisions? We have to show them what quality looks like. We have to show them what parent power looks like. If not, these amendments, these things, I mean, we filed a lawsuit against the state of California, December of 2020, and we're still in it. Lawsuits take time. They take time and they're cumbersome and they're heavy. And in the meantime, how are we going to make sure kids can read and write? So I'm not saying that these are not levers that we shouldn't push. I think we should push multiple policy levers and programming levels. But these folks will never, ever get it right if we don't put the solutions behind the fight, because they don't know what the hell they are doing. And I'm sorry to sound so passionate about it. I'm damn near about to cry because this stuff is so upsetting. But I think we get it just as wrong on the inside as the people we blame on the outside. And it's almost like we're fighting the battle from both angles. And we still got kids that cannot read and write. Our parents did not ask to come to board meetings. They came to board meetings because we told them that this is the pathway to your liberation. The question I asked us, is this really freedom for our families? Is this really freedom? Are we really giving them what they asked for? Or are we creating more burden for them to get where they asked to be because of sometimes the theater that we create around liberation? I'll end there. Thank you.
Chris, I do want to come to you, but I definitely want to recognize Representative Hassan, who's joined us. And we're going to come to you in a second, Representative. But Chris, I think you wanted to touch on something that Keisha said.
And we can bring the representative in,
Okay,
the honorable representative.
And we'll come right back to you. And
Yeah.
thank you again for
Yeah.
joining us, Representative Hassan. I know you're having a busy day there at the Capitol. Nevada mentioned you all had that rally. But before we actually come to you, I do want to show you and everyone who's participating in our poll what our audience is saying they'd be most comfortable doing as it relates to ensuring this just comes to fruition. So about 31% said they'd be willing to write a letter to a legislator. The second, greatest response is testifying at a hearing and then writing an op-ed, Chris, and so there are folks who are saying, there are things I'm willing to do to get this done. Just tell me what to do. And this is why I really want to come to you, Representative Hassan. Firstly, why champion this? Why put your name and your representation on the line in Minnesota to really advocate for this Page amendment?
Thank you, Curtis, and thank you for the panelists, my fellow panelists. My name's Hoden Hassan. I am a state rep from South Minneapolis. I represent one of the poorest districts in the state of Minnesota. I also represent a district that is 30% Black and 30% Latinx, and also has the only urban Native reservation in the state of Minnesota. So that puts me in a district with a lot of challenge and a lot of need. A district that has not been invested in many years, a district that doesn't have many voices sitting at the table. That's the same district that George Floyd was murdered in, the same district that burned to, you have seen the businesses burn on TV. So, but I'm a product of public education, and so are my children. I went through the public education, struggled with this education system because as a 10-year-old, I came from Africa, where most people are Black and history is not altered. I came to America, where majority of the people are white and history is altered, and people that look like me are just reduced down to talking about slavery and civil rights, and no other contributions to society is ever mentioned. Everything, all the inventors and all the historians and writers and engineers and architects and lawyers and doctors that I learned in this education system were all from the European descent. And that really, does something to your brain. In my first year of college, I took African-American studies, and that really blew my mind. And from there on, I continuously educated myself, and I educated my son, who just graduated from high school and is attending university, first year of university, to tell him, this is what they teach you in school, but here is the real history about people who are not Europeans, because Black people in this country contributed to society a lot, but they don't get the credit that others get. So as someone who has struggled in this education system to exist, to be seen, to be visible, and also struggled with my son, being a Black man who is 6'3", never being treated as a kid. When we went to kindergarten, he looked around, he was like, Mom, are the kids all small or am I giant? I'm like, baby, you were the giant. So I truly believe that if you have a problem, that you should use all tools in the toolbox and all tools that you need until that problem is solved. While I truly believe that we, in our state, we should fully fund education because you need dollars to run the schools. I also believe that there is a systemic barrier. The systemic barrier is that this education system that we have was designed for white students, designed by white people and designed for white students. And our students struggle to exist a system that, explicitly excludes them every single day. They walk into the school classroom and they are written off as problematic. They're written off as, the child is not contributing. Maybe they have a learning disability. Maybe the child doesn't have any reason to contribute because they can't relate to what you're talking about. They can't relate to you as a person. So when I had a conversation with Justice Page, who most people know, He has been a champion for education about this Page Amendment. I jumped on. Right now, our education, our Constitution says that adequate education. So adequate, I'm not a lawyer by any means, but when I had conversation with my lawyer friends, adequate could just mean an open interpretation. That can mean, is there a building? Is there somebody, who's supposed to be a teacher? Is there a desk and a chair? Then that's adequate. I don't think our children should get at the short end of the stick and stick with adequate. Do I believe that, everyone should be at the table, parents should be at the table? Do I believe that, we should engage our communities to design what education looks like for us? Absolutely. But while we get there, I'm also trying to look at every avenue to find solutions for this really, I'm not going to say broken system, intended exclusive system, that does not want our kids to be included. So that's why, and I'm glad that a lot of people said that they are going to write letters to the legislator, because we need everybody to write letters to the legislators, because many people don't believe that what we're doing is going to be impactful, but I believe it and I stand by it.
Thank you so much. And, Chris, I want to come to you, but I want to put this fight in a larger context, particularly with those of us who are really advocating for, educational excellence in this country every day. And maybe, this constitutional amendment is not something you work on every day, but I believe it's a foundation of a lot of the other things that we're fighting for. And so in many ways, I think this so-called education reform movement, I believe, is at an inflection point. People are sort of going back in many ways to the drawing board about how, after all these decades of investment in time, we're not seeing the gains reflected in a lot of what we put our money and time in. And so, Chris, I'll come to you, and I think I want everyone to sort of jump in here. Can the fight for, whether it's school choice, equitable education funding, supporting students with special needs, supporting students, English language learner students, can those fights succeed without this established right to a quality education?
So let me say this: it hasn't thus far. And I want to say some blazingly simple stuff. I want to be the simple guy here, because you have all these like very smart queens on here, and you got me like getting washed out here, bro. Like I see how you stack the deck against me. But let me be simple for a minute, just super simple. We're asking for a constitutional right to a quality education, and there are people against that. Let that sink in. Just let it sink in that somebody, you would say, hey, I think we should have a constitutional right to a high quality education, and that there would be anybody anywhere in the United States who would say, I'm not for that. And it actually is no more fancy than that. Like, if you look at the language that we are trying to get past, it's not super fancy. It's not an outlandish ask. So my question is, if you were against this particular effort, first of all, why do we have to fight so hard? Why is this a fight? Why is this even a thing? Why are we spending so much time having to think about passing a constitutional right to a high quality education, and who would be against it? People who would be against it for all kinds of complex reasons that they might bring up right now, you have to ask them, well, have you been okay with the way things have been so far? Because without a constitutional right to a quality education, we haven't monitored the right things. We haven't paid attention and been held accountable for delivering quality. We haven't had any teeth in the law to make sure that there were some levers to pull when we weren't receiving quality, right? That's what an amendment gets us right now, and we don't have it. We don't have any teeth in the actual law right now for 150 years of failure, 150 years of kids being tracked into very different outcomes, life outcomes, very different prophecies from kindergarten in some places, definitely from middle school, being put on the track to college or being put on some very different track. Minnesota is it's the fourth best place to raise a family in the United States by national rankings. It's the third worst place to raise a Black family by national rankings. That should tell you that it is possible to have like some universal kind of understanding of things that has very disparate impacts on people. We are the Finland of the United States for white people. We are doing worse than Mississippi and other places when it comes to reading for Black kids, right? And here's something I want to say about what Ed Reform does with parents that I got to just call out for our own effort. I'm going to leave it alone. I think Ed Reform idealizes a very specific set of parents for some very stereotypical reasons of which parents are authentic and which ones aren't, and what they want those parents to do and how they want them to show up in the world. But I'm telling you right now, white mothers in suburbs are now having states completely rewrite curricular expectations of what can be taught and what can't be taught. That is Minnesota in a nutshell. That is social power. When you can say my child's uncomfortable and have a law passed within days and weeks that changes the game, is social power. So if we really want to push things in places like Minnesota and elsewhere, we're going to need more people to be accountable for coming to the table on these things. Yes, you can testify. Yes, you can write a letter. Yes, you can show up however you show up. But we don't even need to tell you what to do, because white women's social power in Minnesota, I don't know how it is where you live, but gets things passed or killed in terms of bills like nobody's business, right? So if we want to just be real for a minute, we got to stop having a stereotypical idea of which parents we want to put the onus on to show up and get loud and do things. And while we're letting everybody else off the hook for creating an equitable society, right? Because I can guarantee you, and I say it all the time, friend Linnell Michelson here in Minnesota said it at a school board meeting once. If little white boys and little white girls were failing at the rate that little Black girls and little Black boys are failing, we would have redone the entire system from top to bottom by now. We would have fired people, changed practices and policies. We would have reinstalled an entirely different regime if it was white kids. And I don't know what it's like where you live. I can guarantee you that that's Minnesota in a nutshell.
Christina?
Well, I know where it's like where I live, and here in California with the fifth largest economy in the world, we still can't pass children, more than 50% of our children at grade level for reading and writing. And if you're Black, that's 67% not at grade level for reading and writing, and 80% not for math, right? And so how is the upward mobility going to happen? I really wanted to really hone in on the way that parents are viewed differently in those experiences, right? I always ask the question, when are our legal experiences going to match our actual experiences with freedom? Are legal freedoms going to match our actual experience with freedom, right? And so this is what we're talking about. What is that pathway of liberation? Why is there two separate lanes where you have people that are fighting against something that should be fundamental, right? We have consistently had to codify what should be innate and human and humane. And so why are those separate lanes existing? And the people that are opposing a quality education, why are they in that separate lane? And then us as parents that are advocating for a quality education viewed as the villain or the enemy, right? And why do they have more social and economic capital to be listened to than the people that are just seeking to thrive through the education system so that their children can have upward mobility? There is something backwards about that, right? We should not live in a society that celebrates, venerates, and honors illiteracy, and then says that parents are villains when they stand up to speak up and fight back because they were tired of their children being illiterate and can't read and write. And they're told by compulsory attendance, you have to take your child to school for this many hours a day, this type of setting. Here's the free public school. Come on and enroll them in, or you can get, a truancy officer at your door if you don't, right? And then drop their child off, advocate, and be considered the rowdy, wild parent nobody wants to deal with. And you know what? Just ignore that parent. And they're really just fighting for a basic right for their children to be able to come to school and the school to meet its intended purpose of providing an education. not having a fifth grader who can't read and write, not having a 12th grader graduating from the achievement gap into the racial wealth gap because they're reading at a second or third grade level. And so we really need to ask the people that are opposing our advocacy, why, right? Why? If you can't give a valid reason, then it's just for something that I call, we can't legislate hard change, but we can legislate justice. And so that's what we will pursue, and that's what we'll do.
Did you want to jump in here, Keisha?
I just actually echo everything Chris said. I mean, I feel like he said it in a brilliantly different way than I would have said it, but it's like, I don't know if we just heard him say that, like, when white privileged women don't like something, things change, right? They know exactly what to go over and how to go after it. And things happen overnight. And we create a thing where we are just like accessorizing and playing around the playground on this. And so I think the points I was trying to make earlier was some clear examples of like how you just don't question, you don't ask, we don't fuss in those kind of ways. Like, how are we using power to make change, right? In real ways, because, and not asking for permission and not asking to do it in a certain way or following a certain code or some kind of model or whatever, just what's right for you and your community. And that's how we really try to lead this work in Oakland. Everything we bring up, somebody told us to do something different, and no one expected us to do it. But we got to do even more, because I do feel like, to the point he makes, is like, as soon as that CRT popped up, which we weren't even involved in that conversation, like all of a sudden we had white mamas all over the country shaking up the news and shaking up everything on that. So it's regardless of like whether we agree with their position or not, but the ability to move sentiment and get people standing up and changing like the way elections happen and all of that stuff. We need to be doing the exact same things. And we have to do it. And I think we have to do it differently. So I can't say that we can do it in the same ways, but we can do it. We must do it. So that was the only thing that I was going to add to that. I just really, like what Chris said, resonated with me fully.
Curtis, can I ask you a cool question of Keisha about that?
Sure.
I don't mean to hijack, but I do want to ask Keisha what you think about this. We expect our kind of low income families to be on the front lines of a lot of these things, and we want to put them out on the front lines, a lot of things. But people of color, period, who are doing well in life, right, who have some social power, oftentimes I think are left out of I don't know if left out is the right word, but not exactly showing up. In all those suburbs where those white women are expressing social power, there are people of color. 50% of our kids are in the suburbs now, right? And I just don't see our people of color who have achieved a little something in life showing up in the same way that we're always expecting kind of, low income, so-called city people to do. And they're sitting out, I think, is harming us. In Minnesota, for sure, we have entire suburbs where there are people of color who have some social standing, have the ability to make it up to the Capitol and get heard in ways that not everybody else would get heard. And they are sitting this one out. They are actually not, like, I think, using their social power for something so simple and basic as a constitutional amendment for a high quality education. That should not, in my mind, that should not be the case. We keep asking the same people to do things that they don't have time to do when we have all these other folks who are kind of off the hook from using their power too.
Well, Chris, go ahead, Keisha. I want to jump in as well. Go ahead, Keisha.
I didn't know if Chris was asked. I wanted to respond to it, but I didn't know if he had a specific question for
I was just
me,
asking
because I
you,
definitely had a
think,
connection. I definitely had a deep, I definitely resonated in the sense of, and it sparked something too that I want to reflect on after this conversation. I did just want to respond to Chris, what he said in two ways. One is we have to stop asking our low income families to be on the front lines, right? I think the huge reason of why we created the hub is because it was about giving our families the privilege that they have been fighting at the board meetings for. Like, you did this so your kids could read now. So we need to make sure your kids are reading now. Our advocacy needs to be behind that, right? We are definitely having our low income families in a wait and see, okay? You come to this meeting and we'll wait and see what happens. And advocacy is long and it's hard, and it may not get to those solutions. So I just want to sort of first echo, Chris, that like where we're moving is, and we have a Power Parent Playbook on our website that we talk about it. And then one of the main things we put is burden the system and not the families. We have to stop asking our families to take on what we're asking them to take on. And this is why I was saying that the solutions are so important, because when I ask you to show up, we're gonna move mountains. I'm not gonna ask you to show up just on some okie doke so it can look like we have a lot of parents in the room. You know, we do that. You know, we've had Ubers and transportation and childcare and all of this stuff for a parent to go up to speak for 2 minutes, that then gets cut down to 1 minute because everybody else wants to speak. And we don't even recognize how much that parent had to do to get to that space at that time, at that moment, right? And to the other point that Chris is talking about, you know, it's like my family's from Mississippi. My grandmother only got a 9th grade education before she gave birth to my mom, but that's not my reality right now. So Chris, I would be one of those people that you would consider quote unquote middle class, right? And I do believe that I have a responsibility because somehow some stuff got worked out for me where I was able to go to college and get not 1 degree, but 2 degrees and change the trajectory of my family. It didn't matter that we started off in literally a shack in Mississippi. Like we still have the pictures, but it's my responsibility to step back in the right ways to make sure that more Lakishas, more Chris's, more Christina's, more Nevada's, more Hodan, like that we have a more opportunity for that. So it's very interesting that you talk about like the middle class, you know, this, like we do have a responsibility, and our responsibility is to take burden off of our brothers and sisters, right? Take the burden off. And we can only do that by being smart about the way we do the work. But so often the ways we do the work, we put more burden on the families who are already burdened, and we, without any real promises that their kids are going to read and be able to do math. I don't know how it is in Minnesota or Palm Springs, but only 15% of Black kids are proficient in math. So you could just cut off all of those opportunities there. So what we're doing with literacy, we're about to do with math. Because like you said, Chris, we should just have that basic right. And like I said before, we should have this amendment on the books. But once we get it on the books, how are we going to make sure it matters for the communities and families it needs to matter for? I think that's where we come in around. How do we show them how to do this right? Because they keep getting it wrong.
We have a couple minutes left, and I definitely want to get to Representative Hassan in Nevada. And I want to just recognize one thing. Throughout this Black History Month, folks are going to quote Dr. King a lot. And the idea that we highlighted in our last our last session around the letter to a Birmingham jail, and this message, particularly the white moderates, that says, wait, not now. And I think, Chris, you sort of amended that. So you're saying what? And Black moderates who are saying not yet, not now. So Representative Hassan, what is your message to those who are saying not now, wait, this can wait for another session? Why so in our final 2 comments, Nevada, Representative Hassan, why now?
Yeah, I'll go really quickly. You know, we're not talking about dismantling the public education system in Minnesota. In fact, what we're talking about is strengthening the public education system in Minnesota and creating accountability in our schools. So now is the time. All the pieces are here. We really can't wait any longer. We can't afford to wait any longer. And we know that what we're doing has not worked and the problem persists. It is absolutely the time right now to get this on the ballot. This year is like a statewide election, and every single legislator is on the ballot across Minnesota. And we know that people are going to be showing up in November to vote. And we also know that we have 79% of Minnesotans support the Page Amendment. We want it on the ballot this year. We want to see it pass, and we want to start implementing quality public education after that enactment. And I will pass it over to my colleague, Representative Hassan, to talk about the urgency.
Thank you, Nevada. I think Nevada hit this on the head. I think the wait is over. We can't wait anymore. Our kids can't wait. The more we delay this is more kids not graduating, high school, more kids not going to college, more kids not becoming productive members of our society. And Chris, said this earlier. Minnesota is a great state for white people, but it's also a terrible state for Black and Indigenous and people of color. We have the worst education gap, we have the worst economic gap, we have the worst health disparity, you name it, housing, and that needs to end. And if we are educating our our young people and giving them the opportunity to become astronauts and physicians and pilots and engineers and every possible thing that they can imagine, if we're providing that, then it's gonna the economy is gonna look better. Forget about moralities, because sometimes people don't like to talk about morality. Let's talk about an economic opportunity. Minnesota needs these young people. Minnesota needs these people to join the workforce and become productive members of society. And if we don't do this, we're just going to continue talking about admiring disparities, because that's what we do in Minnesota. We admire disparities. We talk about it, but we don't do anything about it. So I think that, the people that are listening that are from Minnesota, I want you to call your legislator. I need you to call your senator, House, rep. I also need you to call all leaderships, governor, speaker, majority leader in the Senate. You need to tell them that we need this amendment. We needed it yesterday, but we need it today. We need to pass this legislation. And then also one more thing before I forget, Keisha, I really need to connect with you, because I wanna get my hands on the way that you guys are doing the literacy, because our literacy for Black students and students of color, Indigenous students, is terrible. And then also quality education. For this amendment, we want parents to define quality. We want educators to define quality, and we want stakeholders to define quality. I don't want my colleagues who know nothing about the Black community or the brown community or the Indigenous community to sit at their desk and say, okay, this is what quality looks like. So that's why I'm excited about this amendment. I think it would make a huge difference. With that said, we're still gonna push all the other issues, including literacy. Black students are the only group of people that last year their graduation rates dipped, and that's a shame. That we should be shameful about that, because at this day and age, kids should have every opportunity to graduate from high school.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank you all for joining us today, everyone who listened in. And I want to end on a quote I heard recently. And it said, if you ever wondered what you'd be doing, what you would have done during slavery, during the Holocaust, or during the civil rights movement, you're doing it right now. Listen to that. If you ever wondered what you'd be doing, if I lived during the civil rights movement, I'd be marching with King, I'd be doing these things. What you would have done then, you're doing right now. And so if you want to get involved in this fight, if you're saying, I don't live in California or Minnesota, and I want the fight to come to my state, follow the 74, follow Education Civil Rights Now, the National Parents Union, the Oakland Reach, Our Children Minnesota, and Brightbeam to get involved in this fight. Again, thank you all so much for joining us today. Happy Black History Month. And let's continue this fight to ensure that no child in this country does not have a quality public education. Thank you so much. Have a great day.